I'm 82. Every morning I drink my coffee on the porch, alone. And people hear that word and their eyes fill with pity. Poor thing, all by herself. But I had 30 years to learn something. The coldest, emptiest, dying years of my life. I wasn't alone for one of them. I was married. Same bed, same name, same church. And I was dying inside every single one. The whole county called him the most blessed young man they'd ever seen. It took me 30 years to understand the way he smiled at me at that altar. If anyone ever told you that staying is faith and leaving is failure, stay with me, tap like, and tell me below where you're listening from. This one is for you. The town I grew up in had one stoplight and 3 churches, and the biggest of the 3 had my family's name on the cornerstone, Brown Memorial. My grandfather laid the first brick, and my father preached from its pulpit for 41 years. When I was a little girl, I thought God lived in that building. I would press my hand flat against the white clapboard on a summer evening and feel the heat the wood had soaked up all day, and I believed I was touching the warmth of the Lord himself. It was a plain church, Baptist plain. Wooden pews worn smooth and pale, where 100 years of hands had gripped them. A simple pulpit my grandfather built with his own 2 hands. No gold, no statues, nothing on the walls, but the painted numbers of the hymns we'd sing that Sunday. We sang from the old hymnal, "It is well with my soul" on the good days, just as I am at every invitation. And every Sunday morning of my childhood, my father stood up front in his one good suit, and I sat in the second pew, hands folded, ankles crossed, the pastor's daughter. The picture of everything a girl in that town was supposed to be. My mother sat beside me. I'll come back to my mother. You'll need to understand her to understand me. When I was 19, a young man started coming to Wednesday night prayer meeting, Raymond. He came from 2 counties over, and he had a way about him. I want you to picture it because the whole town pictured it the same way. Tall, a jaw like something carved, a Bible he carried like it was part of his hand. When he prayed out loud, the older women would dab their eyes. When he sang, he found the harmony without being taught. Within a month, the deacons were saying his name in the same breath as the word future. The most blessed young man any of them had ever seen. That's what they called him. I heard it so many times I started to believe it was the truth. And he chose me. That's how it felt, like being chosen. He'd wait by my father's study after the service. He'd carry my mother's casserole dish to the car. He knew things about the church I didn't even know. Which deacon was behind on his tithe, what the roof repair was going to cost, which family was thinking of leaving. I remember thinking, isn't it wonderful? A young man who cares this much about the house of God. I didn't think to ask why a man courting a girl would know more about her father's church than he knew about her. I'll tell you something I noticed and let go of. My father loved him, not the way you approve of a daughter's suitor. More than that, my father, who weighed every word like it cost him money, never once questioned Raymond, never tested him the way fathers do. The first time Raymond came to Sunday dinner, my father shook his hand and held it a beat too long, and something moved across his face that I didn't have a name for then. I have a name for it now. It was relief. We were married the next spring. I was 20. I can still see the church that morning. white ribbon on the pews, my mother in the front row, thin as a reed in her good dress, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. And my father walked me down the aisle and then went around to stand in the pulpit himself, because of course he was going to marry us. Who else? And right before he began, he leaned down to me. His hands were shaking. I thought it was joy. I thought, look, my strong father is overcome. He loves me so. And he put his trembling mouth close to my ear. And what he whispered I have turned over in my mind for 62 years. He didn't say, I love you. He didn't say, be happy. He said, now it's safe. Now it'll all be safe. And he straightened up and smiled out at the congregation. And I stood there in white and told myself he meant my future, my safety, my happiness. He didn't mean me at all. But it would be 30 years before I understood whose safety my father was thanking God for that morning. And by then, it had already cost me everything a woman has to give. The first year, I told myself it was an adjustment. Every marriage is, the older women said. You learn each other, so I learned him. I learned that the man the whole county loved went quiet the second our front door closed behind us. I learned that his warmth was something he put on with his Sunday suit and took off the same way. At church, he'd rest his hand on the small of my back, and the deacons' wives would just glow at the two of us. At home, he could go 3 days without looking at my face. I want to say this carefully, the way a woman my age can finally say things. I was 20 years old. I was a bride. And the man I had married never once reached for me in the dark. Not once. I would lie on my side of the bed listening to him breathe, close enough to touch, and I learned to keep my hands folded on top of the quilt the same way I'd folded them in the second pew my whole life. Like there was a part of me I wasn't allowed to use. I told myself he was tired. I told myself he was holy. I told myself 100 things because the truth, that my own husband felt nothing for me, nothing, that I was furniture in my own marriage. The truth was too heavy to pick up. He poured himself into the church instead. Within 2 years, he was assistant pastor. Within 5, everybody understood that when my father stepped down, Raymond would step up, and the cornerstone would still say Brown, but the man in the pulpit would be him. He was good at it, I'll grant him that. He could make a whole sanctuary weep and then laugh in the same sermon. The church grew. The offering plates got heavy, and every soul in that congregation believed they were watching a love story. The golden young preacher and the pastor's faithful daughter, when the truth was that I made his coffee and ironed his shirts and sat in the second pew and had not been touched by a living hand in years. I went to my father once, only once. I was maybe 26. I didn't have the words for what was wrong, so I just said, Daddy, I don't think Raymond loves me. I'll never forget how he didn't even look up from his Bible. He turned a page, and he said, Ellen, a brown woman doesn't marry for herself. She marries for what she carries. And he went on reading like he'd told me what time supper was. I carried that sentence out of his study, and I buried it, because I didn't know what to do with it. A brown woman doesn't marry for herself. I thought he was talking about duty, about being a good wife, putting the church first, all the things I'd been raised on. I filed it under sacrifice, and I kept going. It would be more than 20 years before I dug that sentence back up and finally heard what my father had actually told me, that I had never been a daughter to be loved. I had been something to be spent. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I couldn't see it, why I let it go year after year, you have to understand the woman who taught me how a brown woman suffers. You have to understand my mother. My mother was the first pastor's wife I ever knew, and she was a ghost long before she died. I remember her hands more than her face, always moving, casseroles for the sick, flowers for the altar, the nursery on Sunday, the visitation list, the women's circle, the funerals. Oh, the funerals. She made the egg salad for every funeral in that town for 30 years. She was the one the church called when a baby came or a husband left or a body had to be washed. And she did it. She did all of it, with a soft voice and a bowed head. And I grew up thinking that was simply what a good woman was. A pair of moving hands and a bowed head. What I didn't see, because children don't see it, was that she was disappearing, a little every year. By the time I was a teenager, she was so thin the wind seemed to bother her. She'd sit at the kitchen table at the end of a day and just look at the wall, and if I asked her what was wrong, she'd smile and say, "Nothing the Lord can't carry, baby." She gave herself to that church the way a candle gives itself to a flame, completely, and until there was nothing left. She died when I was 31, worn clean out. The doctor put words on it, but I knew what really killed her. She'd been poured out so long, there was nothing left in the cup. And here is the thing I have to tell you, the thing I didn't understand for decades. Near the end, when the fever was on her and the room smelled of medicine, she called me close. Her hand came up off the quilt and gripped my wrist with more strength than I thought she had left. And she pressed something into my palm. It was a key, an old brass key worn smooth, the key to the church's front doors. The pastor's wife always carried it, and she looked at me with those fever-bright eyes, and she said, "He'll choose the one who keeps the doors open. Your daddy always does. He chose your daddy that same way once." I thought she was out of her head. I thought the fever was talking. I held that key, and I patted her hand, and I said, "Rest now, Mama." And I let the strangest, truest thing anyone ever said to me float right past my ear like it was nothing. She died 2 days later, and I put the key in a drawer, and I went back to my cold marriage, and I did not think about what she'd said for 18 more years. I want you to hold on to that key. I didn't understand it, but I'm an old woman now, and I've learned that the most important things people tell us are almost always the ones we're not ready to hear. I was 49 years old when the floor finally gave way under 30 years of my life. My father had passed the spring before, and in the going through of his things, that terrible intimate task of emptying a dead man's desk, I found the letters. They weren't hidden. That's what undid me. They were just there in a drawer tied with a shoelace, the way a man keeps things he isn't ashamed of. Letters between my father and Raymond from before the wedding, from when I was 19 years old and thought I was being chosen. I'm not going to read you those letters. I couldn't, even now. But I'll tell you what was in them, because you've come this far with me and you've earned the truth the way I had to earn it, sitting on my dead father's floor with my whole life turning to smoke in my hands. It was an arrangement. That's the plain word for it. My father had a church and no son to leave it to, and he had watched it slip away from other men, watched the doors close on congregations that died with their pastors. He was not going to let that happen to Brown Memorial. So when a gifted, ambitious young man came through who wanted a pulpit more than he wanted anything on this earth, my father gave him one. And the price of the pulpit, the condition, the thing that sealed it, was me. Raymond never wanted me. I knew that already. I'd known it in my body for 30 years. What I didn't know until I sat on that floor was that my father had known it too, from the very beginning. He hadn't been fooled. He hadn't been a grieving man tricked by a charming boy. He had been the one holding the pen. And every seed I'd swallowed and never digested came up all at once. Now it's safe. He hadn't been blessing my marriage at that altar. He'd been thanking God the church was secured, with his daughter as the down payment. A brown woman doesn't marry for herself. It wasn't a lesson in sacrifice. It was a confession said to my face, and I'd been too well trained to hear it. And my mother, oh, my mother, with the fever on her and the key in her hand. He'll choose the one who keeps the doors open. He chose your daddy the same way once. She wasn't out of her head at all. She was trying with the last strength she had to warn me that I was living her life, that she'd been spent for that building, and now I was being spent for it too. And the only thing she had to leave me was a key, and a warning I was 30 years too young to understand. I sat on that floor until the light went out of the room. I didn't cry, not at first. I want to tell the younger women listening to me something about that moment, because some of you know exactly the floor I'm talking about, even if your floor has a different name. When the truth finally comes for the lie you've been living, it doesn't feel like breaking. It feels like the most terrible kind of quiet, like a clock you'd heard your whole life finally stopping, and only in the silence do you realize how loud it had been. I want you to do something for me right now before I go on. If any part of this is your story, if you ever sat on a floor like that, or you're sitting on one now, I want you to tell me where you are. Just the town, the state, the country. Put it down in the comments below, because I read them, and I pray over them, every name and every place. You are not a stranger to me, and you are not alone in this. Tell me where you're listening from, and let me carry your name to the Lord the way nobody carried mine. The next morning, I did the one thing a brown woman was never, ever supposed to do. But before I tell you what I did, and what it cost me, and what it gave me, I have to tell you about a girl named Hannah. Because everything I learned on that floor, I would have given anything to have someone tell me at 20. And years later, the Lord put a girl in front of me at exactly the age I'd been, about to make exactly my mistake, and gave me the chance I never got. Hannah cut my hair. That's how I knew her, a young thing at the little salon in town, 19, 20 maybe, with a ring on her finger and a wedding 3 weeks out. I was well into my new life by then, the life I'll tell you about in a moment, and I'd come in just for a trim, and she talked the whole time the way nervous brides do. She talked about the dress and the flowers and the cake, and then, somewhere in there, she went quiet, and she met my eyes in the mirror, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Everybody's so happy. I just wish I felt the way everybody thinks I feel." I want you to understand, I almost let it go, the way everyone had let me go. It would have been so easy to smile and say, "Oh, honey, that's just nerves. Every bride feels that." That's the script. That's what you're supposed to say. And I opened my mouth to say it. And then I saw my mother's hands. And I felt that brass key in my palm like it was still there. And I thought, no, not this one. Not if I can help it. So I turned around in that chair with half my hair still wet. And I took that girl's hands. And I said the truest thing I knew. I said, Hannah, look at me. Do you love him? Not is he good on paper. Not does your family love him. Not is everybody happy. Not is it too late to stop the cake. Do you love him? And does that man love you? Not the idea of you. Not what marrying you gets him. You. Because if the answer is no, then every soul telling you to walk down that aisle is asking you to spend a life you only get one of. And there is no church, no family name, no tradition on this earth worth the price of your one wild life. She started to cry, and I held her hands, and I let her. And I told her the thing nobody told me, that the fear of what people will say is the cheapest fear there is, because the people doing the saying will go home to their own lives and forget all about you, and you'll be the one lying awake for 30 years. I told her that staying somewhere God never asked you to stay is not faithfulness. It's just fear wearing faithfulness as good coat. I don't know what Hannah did. She moved away that summer and I lost track of her, and I've made my peace with not knowing. Some seeds you plant and never see come up. But I know this. Somebody finally said it out loud to one frightened girl in a mirror. And maybe that's part of why God kept me on this earth so long, to say to her and to you the thing that nobody had the courage to say to me. Now. Let me take you back to that morning, the morning after the floor. The morning I became the woman this whole town would whisper about for the next 3 decades. I was 50 years old. I had no money of my own. A brown woman doesn't. Everything had always run through the man. I had no skill anyone would pay for. I had a name in a town where that name was a church, and I was about to make that name a scandal. And I packed one suitcase. I left the house keys on the kitchen table, and right beside them I left that old brass key, my mother's key, the church key, because I finally understood it had never been mine to carry. It had been my chain. I set it down, and I walked out of the house I'd been buried alive in for 30 years, and I did not look back. You want to know what they said. Of course they said it all. That I'd lost my mind, that I'd abandoned a man of God, that I was bitter, that I was selfish, that I'd thrown away a blessing other women would pray for. Raymond, to his great relief, I'm sure, kept the church and his good name, and he told everyone he'd done all he could for his poor, troubled wife. I lost the only world I'd ever known in a single afternoon. The casserole circle, the pew, the only family the cornerstone had ever given me. Gone. I was 50 years old and starting from nothing, alone, in a one-room apartment over the hardware store, and the whole town agreed I had ruined my life. And listen to me now, because this is the part I came all this way to tell you. That first morning in that apartment, I woke up before the sun the way I always had, and I made 1 cup of coffee. 1. Just for me. The first cup of coffee in 30 years I didn't make for somebody else first. And I carried it to the window, and I sat down, and I waited for the loneliness to come. The terrible loneliness everyone had promised me, the punishment. I sat there and braced for it like you brace for a wave, and it didn't come. what came in that gray quiet with the steam rising off that one cup was something I had no word for at first. The room was silent, but it wasn't the silence of the house I'd left. That cold silence with another person in it who didn't want you, which is the loneliest silence God ever allowed to exist. This was a different silence. This was a silence with the Lord in it. For the first time in my entire life, I was alone and I was not afraid. And I understood all at once that I had never once been still enough to hear God over the noise of trying to be what everybody needed me to be. I had spent 30 years married and surrounded, and unbearably alone. And here I was, by every account, abandoned, and I was not alone at all. He was there. He had been there the whole time, waiting in the quiet I never let myself sit in. And I put my face in my hands over that little cup of coffee and I wept. But they were not the tears of the floor. They were the other kind, the kind that come when a thing that was bent your whole life finally stands up straight. I subscribe to a simple idea now, and I'll say it plainly so you can carry it out of here. The thing the world calls your worst loss may be the very door the Lord has been holding open for you the whole time. I thought leaving was the end of my life. It was the first morning of it. I am 82 years old. I have lived alone for 32 years now, in a little house with a porch that faces east. So the morning comes to me first. And every day of those 32 years, I have made one cup of coffee and carried it out to the swing and watched the light come up over the field. And I have not been lonely. I want to be careful with that word now at the end, because I used it wrong my whole life. What I called loneliness for 50 years was never being alone. It was being unloved with someone right beside me. And what the world calls my loneliness now, this old woman and her coffee and her quiet, that isn't loneliness either. I learned its real name. It is the quietest mercy of my life. People look at the arithmetic of me and they shake their heads. 30 years a wife, 32 years alone, and they decide the alone part is the sad part. But I told you at the very beginning that only one of those numbers ever felt like death, and now you know which one. It wasn't the 32. It was the 30. The dying happened inside the marriage, in the cold bed, and the second pew, and the casseroles for a love that never existed. The living happened out here in the quiet, alone with God. My mother never got her morning. She was poured out and she went into the ground without one single cup of coffee that was only hers. I carry her with me to that swing every day. And I think she'd be glad. I think she'd look at her daughter, finally still, finally herself, finally found by the Lord. She served so hard she forgot to let him hold her, and I think she'd rest. There is a verse I couldn't read for years without my throat closing, and now it's the truest thing I own. It's from the 27th Psalm. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. My mother forsook me into the grave before she could save me. My father forsook me at an altar before I was old enough to know what he was doing. The two people who should have stood between me and the world handed me to it instead. And that verse does not pretend they didn't. It just promises what comes after the forsaking. Then the Lord will take me up. He took me up. He has been taking me up every morning for 32 years on a porch swing, over one cup of coffee, In a quiet so full of Him, there's no room left for fear. So if you're listening to me and you're young, and somebody is asking you to spend your one life to keep their building standing, don't. And if you're listening to me and you're old, and you've already spent it, and you think the quiet ahead of you is a punishment, it isn't. It's the door. Walk through it. He's on the other side, and He has been waiting the whole time, patient as the morning, to take you up. The sun's coming over the field now. My coffee's still warm, and I am not alone.